Hello and welcome to this video. My name is Kendra. This is balancedskein, where I talk about all things yarny related. Hello, my name is Kendra and welcome back to another video. Today we're going to be talking about everything I knit in March. March was pretty light in terms of finished objects. I feel like it didn't feel as productive, but I know it's partly because I have multiple WIPs going. And yeah, let's just jump into the meat of this video. So I have one finished object to share, one half finished object, and 3 active WIPs that I have worked on in March. And I also have some acquisitions to talk about. Yes, the no buy is still going. I can explain. So we'll talk about that at the end. So let's talk about my first and only finished object for March. This was a WIP in last month's video, so you might have seen it before, and I have posted it on Instagram, but here it is. It is the Musselburgh hat by Isolde Teague. I'll put it on. We like it. It's very warm. It's not too tight. I think it fits really well. The yarn I used was Rowan Lane Fibers Hearth Fingering Base. The color is Pomelo. So all of Rowan Lane Fibers yarns are dyed with plant materials, so it's all naturally dyed, and she's able to create some really beautiful colors, and this one spoke to me. And I think this was the last yarn purchase of 2023 for me. It was like my last hurrah before the no buy kicked off. It might have actually been ordered on December 31st. So yeah, I really like it. With a close-up of the texture here. So I'm sure you've heard about the Musselburgh hat, but it's unique in its construction. So you start knitting from the crown, you increase out, you knit a long tube of stockinette, and then you decrease. And as you can see, I lost a game of yarn chicken, so I had to use some scraps to close up the end. But I just put this on the inside, and nobody's gonna know, so I have no complaints there. So I did knit the hat maybe 2, probably 3 inches longer than the pattern instructs. So I knew there was definitely a possibility I would run out of yarn, and I was okay with that because, again, whatever I have wherever I run out of yarn, I'll just use something from scraps and it'll go on the inside of the hat. So I wasn't too worried about that. I just wanted to make sure I knit it long enough to where I was comfortable. And honestly, I might have overshot it a bit. I think on my next version, I'll knit it an inch or so shorter than I knit this version. And I have a little bit of room that I think in my next version, I would like to eliminate. So that's the only thing I would really change. Everything else about this hat, I'm really happy about it. Definitely want to make more Musselburgh hats. I think for me, this is something I would consider to be like a statement color. This really pops, especially when I wear it with my winter coat and other accessories, which are all neutral colors. So I think this works really well as a hat to wear at the tail end of winter going into spring. But when I'm thinking about a hat I want to wear in deep winter, I might opt for something more neutral. So my future Musselburgh hat will be in a more understated color, but I really do like this, and honestly, I have worn it nearly every day since knitting it. It was a pretty satisfying thing to knit. Like, it is a lot of knitting because you're essentially knitting 2 hats and shoving one inside the other. So in terms of the amount of knitting required, it's a lot for a hat, But because it's all stockinette, not a purl inside, no seaming or super complicated construction elements, it makes it really satisfying, and it works up, I think, a little faster than you might expect. And for me, this was really great for commute knitting or TV knitting, knitting while doing something that might require some mental focus, but that doesn't require my hands. This was the perfect project for that. It's kind of a pain to start. So one thing about the start, it instructs for some, I can't remember the technique that it calls for to start the hat, but it's a special cast on, I think a pinhole cast on, that basically allows you to cast on the stitches in a circular fashion to where you don't have to go back and close up the hole. Because to start, I think you cast on 8 stitches, for example, and a pinhole cast on allows you to do that and then to start knitting and have a really nice finished closed start. But I just did a regular long tail cast on for 8 stitches, and then I used my tail at the end to sort of loop through them and cinch it closed. And I don't think you could really tell the difference looking at it. Like, maybe it's not as clean as some other versions, but A, nobody's staring that closely at the top of my head. B, if I was really that pressed about it, I would just wear the inside on the outside. Granted, I had to do some yarn substitution there, but if that wasn't the case, I would just flop the inside to the outside. To me, it doesn't make a huge difference, and it was much easier to do a long tail cast on than to learn a pinhole cast on, which I did for my first version of the Musselburgh hat that I knit as a gift for someone, and I found it fiddly. So I don't think it's worth the trouble personally. And if you were on the fence about starting the Musselburgh hat because you didn't want to deal with the fiddly cast on, take it from me, it's not all it's cracked up to be, because this I'm perfectly happy with. The other thing too is it's kind of annoying starting this hat to have to do magic loop or DPNs or whatever your preferred method of small circumference knitting is before you can switch to, for me, a 16-inch circular to do the majority of the body of the hat, and then have to switch over to another small circumference knitting at the end. Doing it at the end is pretty standard for most hats that are knit bottom up, but to have to start on that too kind of makes it annoying, because this isn't something like, if I want something quick to cast on that doesn't take a lot of brain power or awkward knitting at the start, you know, I would cast on a hat that's bottom up. I could just cast on all the stitches, do my knitting, and all of the fiddly bits are at the end. But this isn't something that you can casually cast on and like have some comfort knitting right away. You got to do the increases before it gets to that point, if that makes sense, at least in my opinion. But overall, very happy with how this turned out, and there will definitely be more Musselburghs in my future. That's my finished object. All right, so the next, you might consider a finished object, but it's technically a half finished object because it is a sock. Not a pair of socks, but just one singular sock. So this is the Alma Sock. Focus, focus. This is a pattern by Emily from the New York Year, and it is a beautiful textured sock. It is knit cuff down. It starts with a 2x2 rib, and then it goes into a 3x1 rib for the back with this textured twisted stitch detail along the sides. And the center panel is a 1x1 moss stitch. And the heel, this is something I haven't done before, is a reverse stockinette heel. I usually default to a slip stitch heel, so this was new for me, and it's pretty cool. I mean, overall it's the same idea, like in terms of how it's constructed. You're just changing up the stitch pattern for the actual heel flap. And yeah, you knit, the bottom is stockinette, and the toe is a pretty standard wedge toe. I think the decreases are different than the socks I normally knit. You kind of end with less stitches, so you do more decreases, and it results in a relatively pointy toe. But I mean, it's fine either way. That doesn't really bother me. It's just different than what I'm used to for socks. This was my first very textured sock. So I've done ribbed socks, I've done broken rib socks, but this is the first sock that has a distinct pattern that requires following a chart. And I really liked it. It was a pretty fun change from the types of socks that I normally knit myself. And I think in the future I will knit more textured socks. In fact, one of the perks of test knitting for the New York year, she gives you a code to get one of her patterns for free. So I picked up another sock pattern from her. I can't remember which one I got, but all of her sock patterns are pretty textured. So they have some type of texture design on them. So I figured I would just keep going down that path and knit more textured socks in the future. I did knit this entire sock on double pointed needles, which was fine. Honestly, no complaints. I experienced some laddering. So I think here on the bottom of the foot is an example of the laddering. Actually, can you see? Yeah, this line here is one point where my double pointed needles met. However, on the rest of the sock, they kind of met at a point that already would be a visual line in the patterns. But overall, positive experience, even with the DPNs. However, I think the second sock of this pair, I'm going to use my magic loop sock needles. The only reason I cast this on with DPNs is because I didn't want to use my 9-inch circulars. They hurt my hands. I'm kind of over that phase of my knitting life. And my long sock needles were being borrowed. So it was kind of out of necessity, and I didn't want to miss the test deadline. So I just cast on with the DPNs and delivered my test knitting obligation. But yeah, the second sock will likely be on magic loop, and who knows if that's going to change my gauge, but I'm willing to risk it because DPNs are fine, but definitely not my favorite way to knit socks. I'm definitely leaning more towards the magic loop lifestyle for my small circumference knitting. So yeah, these are the Alma socks. They are available for purchase now. So I will link the pattern, the Ravelry pattern, down below. Feel free to check it out for yourself and knit yourself a pair. I would highly recommend. I mean, look how gorgeous this is. The yarn is a custom dye job by Distortion Fibers for Miss Pearl, which is my local yarn store. Really beautiful green. Nothing else to say there. Very soft, beautiful color. Those are the socks. Okay, so let's talk about WIPs. I'm going to talk about them in order of cast on. I have 3, which is not very typical for me, especially because 2 of them are garments. I'm leaning into the multiple WIP lifestyle. What can I say? All right, so first up is my Rift tee. Pardon me. So I have knit this pattern before. Here's my swatch for those of you curious. The yarn is a mono awa. I met gauge on the recommended needle, which is 5.5 millimeter, and it calls for sport weight yarn, which is what I have. So the gauge is actually quite loose. Here's what the yarn tag looks like. A mono awa, 55% baby alpaca, 26% merino wool, 19% Pima cotton, made in Peru, 328 yards per 100 grams, and the color I have is 11.19. So that's the specs of the yarn. Very beautiful, squishy, drapey yarn. I will show you now what my WIP looks like. There's a lot going on here, a lot of loose ends that will require weaving. But here it is. So I am mostly finished. Sleeve 1 is done. I did a basic bind off there, and as you can see by the 2 remaining stitches, I only have 2, or the stitch markers, I only have 2 more decreases to go on the second sleeve and I'll be done. Hopefully later today so I can block it and wear it to YarnCon tomorrow. But yeah, that's where we are. I did a few modifications, so let's talk about those. The first is for the twisted rib. This pattern has calls for twisted rib on the hem, the cuffs, and there are twisted rib columns that go down both the inside of the sleeve and on either side of the body. So for the twisted rib, I did half twisted rib. I don't know how well you can see, but if you look closely, you can see that the columns in between the twisted knit stitches are very loose. And that's because I only did half twisted rib. The pattern calls for you to do knit 1 through the back loop and purl 1 through the back loop, and then vice versa on the wrong side of the garment. So both the knit columns on the right and wrong side are twisted, but purling through the back loop is not a very pleasant experience. I think most of you might agree with me on that. So when I cast this on, I was kind of on autopilot and I just defaulted to doing half twisted rib. Didn't realize the pattern, I didn't remember the pattern calling for a full twisted rib. But this is what the inside of the ribbing looks like, which for the most part looks like a normal 1x1 rib. I didn't realize I was deviating from the pattern until I had joined the body in the round. So the entire hem was already knit. I was not gonna go back, so half twisted rib it is. The other modification is that I did not do the twisted rib along the inside of the arm. So here's where the body meets the arm. And yes, I have the twisted rib column on the body, but I did not continue it along the arm because I just didn't feel like it. The other modification is the neckline. So I believe the pattern calls for a slip stitch with a crochet hook along the neck, but I just did a single crochet. I don't know. It just felt right in the moment. The other modification is for the shoulders. So the pattern calls for a 3 needle bind off on the outside, on the right side of the fabric. I just did a 3 needle bind off on the inside so that the seam is a little more subtle. I also modified the decrease rate on the arm. So the pattern includes instructions on modifying the armhole depth based on a custom bicep measurement. And I have large biceps compared to my bust size. So I utilized those calculations and made my armhole deeper based on my row gauge, which means that I picked up a lot more stitches than the pattern called for. I think I was at least 20 stitches more than what was written into the pattern. So I had to squeeze in more decreases along the same length than the pattern sort of instructed, right? So for my size, the pattern instructed to knit 9 rounds and then do a decrease round. So decreasing every 10th round. I'm instead decreasing every 7th round. And that turned out to be that turned out to work pretty well for me. So I have tried it on with the first completed sleeve and I'm really happy with how this sleeve fits. It's not super tight around the cuff, but that's okay. And I also did a standard bind off at the cuff. So I didn't do a sewn bind off, just a regular knit one, slip one over the end. I didn't even bother to bind off in pattern. So there's this very distinct contrast. It's like V's going this way perpendicular to the V's coming vertically from the rib. I think with twisted rib, this type of bind off looks really nice and intentional. And I believe this is the bind off specified in the pattern as well. So I really like the way this looks. So yeah, that is my rift tee. All right, WIP number 2, finally. I'm sure you're tired of me talking about this sweater and not working on this sweater, but I finally was able to cast on my Ward sweater by Sloan Rosenthal. I'll spare you all the details of, well, no, I won't. You're gonna get all the details. But yeah, I've been talking about this sweater for a while. This was supposed to be a birthday month cast on with my friend Felicia, but she had some knitting commitments that she needed to wrap up, so we didn't get to cast on until March. So yeah, I can't remember what day we cast on, but we cast on the same day. And here we are. So this is how far I am into this pattern. It is bottom up and seamed. The pattern calls for you to knit the front and back panel, seam up the sides, leave the armholes open, and then pick up stitches around the armholes to knit the arms top down in the round. Actually, no, knit the arms top down flat and then seam them, which, why not just knit it all in pieces if you're gonna end up seaming the sleeves anyway, kind of a thing. So I may modify the sleeves. We'll see how I feel when I get to that point. Either I'm going to pick up the stitches along the armhole and knit them in the round top down, or I'm just gonna knit them bottom up like the rest of the sweater and seam the entire piece together. The way the pattern is written is kind of like a hybrid of the two in a way that doesn't really make sense to me. So more to come on that. We'll see how I end up tackling the sleeves, but I'm definitely not going to follow the way they are written. For now, I have the front panel completed. So yay! So the shoulder stitches are on waist yarn currently. When I knit the back panel, the pattern instructs to seam the shoulders with the 3-needle bind off. So I will take care of that then. And yeah, this is it. The yarn I'm using is Patton's Classic Wool by Yarn Inspirations. And the color is Natural Heather, I believe. No, Natural Mix. 100% non-superwash wool, worsted weight yarn. And yeah, I might lose some yarn chicken. I might lose at yarn chicken with this pattern. We'll see how much yarn I end up using in the end, but the good thing about this yarn is that it is a commercial yarn. Pretty easy for me to get more if I need to. So I'm not really worried about that. It is what it is. Yeah, there it is. So one modification, the two inner cables, the larger cables, the pattern has you start them on either side at the same point, which meant that you had, I'm not gonna try to explain this. The point is I shifted one of the inside cables so that it is a direct mirroring of the other inside cable. And I did a provisional tubular cast on. Felicia had to help me out a little bit with that. It was the first time I tried this cast on, but a lot easier than the only other tubular cast on I ever attempted at the hands of Andrea Mowry in the Weekender sweater. I couldn't explain to you how the technique is performed, and I'm probably gonna need to refer to some type of tutorial when I cast on the back piece, but we'll cross that bridge when I get there, because yeah, right now I'm focused on finishing up the rift tee, and then I will cast on the second panel of this sweater. but this is a sizable amount of the sweater knit up. Hopefully I can finish it in April. But yeah, that's Ward. And the last WIP I have to share is a sock. So this was a panic cast on. So I had a hair appointment. I had a hair appointment coming up. It was a Friday afternoon. And I like to knit when I get my hair done because there's about 3 to 4 hours of me just sitting and somebody working on my hair, which is the perfect environment to get some knitting done. And at the time, I was finished with my first Alma Sock, and I was finished with the first panel of my Ward sweater, I believe. Either I was finished with it or nearly finished and didn't want to fool around with like trying to follow a chart while, you know, I needed something really simple to work on. Ward sweater wasn't going to work. I didn't want to cast on a textured sock that I would need to follow a chart for. And my rift tee was a WIP, but I was at the point of splitting the front and back and doing the neck shaping and shoulder shaping, which is too complicated for hair appointment knitting in my opinion. So I just grabbed my needles and a skein of sock yarn and I cast on a vanilla sock. In retrospect, I could have definitely cast on the second Alma sock because at that appointment, I only got the cuff done. So I wouldn't have even gotten to the point of having to do the complicated part. So that's fine. But I didn't know that at the time. So I was like, I need to cast on something simple to keep my hands occupied. And so I grabbed some sock yarn that I actually knit up previously in a sock that didn't work out. And yeah, at this point with this yarn, I was just trying to use it up. I don't remember what kind of yarn it is. I couldn't tell you the brand, the fiber content, or the colorway. All I know is that there is nylon in it. The rest, I don't know. It's a pretty cool. So I think it's a 2-ply. It's a 3 or 4-ply, but one of the plies is black. So you have this marling black strand throughout all of the stripes. It is a self-striping yarn, but the stripes don't appear to be uniform. So honestly, it's a mystery as to how this is going to work up. I don't know if it's going to repeat or every stripe is going to be a different width. Who knows? But that's where we are with this. And currently this just sort of lives on my bedside. If I am in the mood to knit a couple of rounds before I fall asleep, I do. But it's not a super high priority for me. Although I would like to finish this in April and have this be my April sock. So yeah, bet you didn't expect an acquisition section. So yes, the no buy is still going strong. However, there were some exceptions that I talked about in my 2023 knitting plan video, and I bought yarn, and it's not one of the exceptions, but I think I'll make an amendment so that going forward, this is a proper exception. So I asked my husband if I were to knit him another pair of socks, what color he would want. He said black. So I got black sock yarn. And I got another near black sock yarn to hold as like a contrast color heel and toe. And out of this, he can get 2 pairs with the colors inverted. And I think he'll be really happy with these. So there it is. That's the acquisition. So black yarn is Ultimate Sock by Musselburgh in the color 195 black. And it's just black. I'm a little concerned because this is a sloppy skein. I hope I don't run into a nightmare trying to get this wound up into a cake. Probably should have looked for a neater skein in the shop. I got both of these from Sister art studio in Chicago. I think that's what it's called. It's the first time I'd ever been there. Really cozy shop. I highly recommend if you're in Chicago to check that shop out. But yeah. Then the second one is Trilogy Yarns Yak Sock. Oh, the Malabrigo yarn is 75% merino superwash and 25% nylon. The yak sock is 70% superwash merino, 20% yak, and 10% nylon. And the color is Wicked. Which is just a dark gray yarn. And I think these will pair nicely together. So no regrets there. And then this is an unofficial acquisition. My mom actually bought this yarn because I offered to knit her like a swimsuit cover up to go over her bathing suit. We are taking a family trip to Jamaica in July. So this is the yarn she picked out. The yarn is True Boo, which I think is 100% rayon from Bamboo. It's a Lion brand yarn. We got this at the Michaels close to my house, and she picked the color. I have 5 skeins, which should be more than enough to knit that pattern for her, and it should be a pretty quick knit because it's knit up on like ginormous needles. So it's an acquisition in the sense that there's new yarn in my home, but it's not yarn for me, so it doesn't count. In March, I used up 259 yards. So the yardage is strictly from finished objects. And the only finished object that I completed in March was my Musselburgh hat. So used 259 yards in March, bringing my total yards used year to date of 3,089 yards. I acquired yarn. I'm not including the True Boo for my mom's cover up, but the 2 skeins of sock yarn that I'm going to make socks for my husband. And in total, that is 850 yards, 857 yards added to my yarn stash, which brings a net impact year to date. I feel like I'm an accountant and I talk about year to date, month over month fluctuations all the time. So this feels like work right now. But anyway, that means the total year to date net reduction in my stash of 2,232 yards. So let's talk about some temptations. I've experienced some temptation for the first time all year in March. So I was coasting. I was going pretty smooth. I wasn't feeling the need to buy any yarn. I was content knitting from my stash. I bought the sock yarn for my husband, not because I just broke down and had a lapse in willpower, but more so because I genuinely want to knit these socks for him. And so I bought the yarn to make that happen because I didn't have it in stash. But there have been some moments where I see a pattern on Instagram or Ravelry and I really, really want to make it, but I don't have the yarn in stash. And I kind of mentally recognize that as a moment where in the past I would have bought the yarn to make the thing and I resisted. The big temptation I experienced this month was a new pattern release by Brooklyn Tweed. It's called the Needle Pullover. It's designed by Jared Flood. It's knit up with a new yarn that they've just released called Reply Rambouillet. It's like a chain ply construction. It looks like it has really good stitch definition. The color options, there aren't a lot of colors that the yarn comes in, but it's really pretty, the colors that are available. It's a gorgeous piece. I'm sure I've popped in some pictures so you can see what it looks like. It looks like the perfect staple sweater. And there are a lot of different versions, so you can make it into a vest, you can make it into a short sleeve top, you can make it into a proper long sleeve sweater. It has some really nice details along the back of the shoulders that I think just bring it all together really nicely. I did the math to determine if I were to buy the reply yarn, which is DK weight yarn by the way, enough to make the size that I wanted to make, which I determined would be size 3, then I would need to buy 15 skeins of that yarn, which would total about $247.50, not including tax or shipping, which I would need to pay if I were to order it from their website. And yeah, so just tack on another $20 for tax and shipping. That's $270 that I would have spent if I wasn't on a yarn ban. So what I am going to do is take that $247.50, transfer it from my checking account to my savings account, and pay myself for the yarn I'm not buying this year. In the meantime, I have some consolation because I have a sweater's quantity of DK weight yarn in my stash. I think it's Kelborn Woolen's Scout yarn in like an oatmeal heather color. Maybe I'll pop in a picture of what that yarn looks like. But it's one of those yarns, I bought a sweater's quantity, but I didn't have a concrete plan as to what I would make with the yarn. So since I purchased the yarn almost a year ago now, I've cycled through at least a dozen different sweater plans for the yarn without really committing to one or the other. And this is no different. I'm changing the plans for that yarn again, but if I were to really want to cast that on before the yarn ban ends, I have something in my stash that will allow me to do that. And so I get the satisfaction of being able to knit this sweater that I fell in love with while also not violating my yarn ban, which in my opinion is a win-win situation. I might try to figure out how soon I can cast it on because I do really like the pattern, and yeah, that was some serious temptation. So that's it. That is everything I knit in March 2023. Thank you for sitting through me rambling about my projects, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.